Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has left plenty of breadcrumbs leading to her vision of where the oil and gas industry in Alberta should go over the next 25 years. But, she drops hints here and drops hints there, but it's not very often that you see them all brought together in one place so that, it's very clear what she's up to. Well, a couple of days ago, she released a mandate letter to Energy Minister Brian Jean. And basically, mandate letter is the Premier telling each of her cabinet ministers what it is that she wants them to achieve in the coming year. Well, this is a real eye-opener, folks. And I have to tell you, when you understand where it is that she wants Alberta to go, you will understand a lot of her politics, and you will understand a lot of the way that she opposes Ottawa and basically beats the drum for oil and gas in Alberta. So let's get into it. I want to talk about three things. Okay, the first one is the volume of oil that she wants to increase. The second one will be the number of pipelines that are required and where they're going to go to get that oil to market. And thirdly, there'd be a number of regulatory changes that would be required. And so she's given Jean the mandate to implement those. Let's start with the volumes. Right now, Alberta produces about 4 million barrels a day. And the conventional oil, light sweet crude oil, is around 500,000, 550,000 barrels a day. It hasn't changed in years, decades, in fact. It's just flat. And the Alberta Energy Regulator is, forecasting a little bit of an increase between now and 2050, but that's it, maybe 575 at most, and then declining. It's all the oil sands. That's where all the growth is going to come from. And so what does Smith want in terms of volumes for the province, which growth will all come from the oil sands? Here's what she says. Implement a roadmap to reach 6 million barrels per day of Alberta oil production by 2030 and 8 million barrels per day by 2035. 8 million barrels a day. Essentially doubling provincial production, but most of that, like 7.5 million barrels a day, would come from the oil sands. Now, how big is the market? Because remember, not all oils are equal, right? And Alberta, the oil sands, produces an ultra sour heavy crude. It's very, very heavy. Compared to probably one of the if it's not the heaviest crude oil in the world, it's very close to it. And in the global market, there's maybe 10 million to 10.5 million barrels of demand for that heavy crude. Now, most of it will come from refineries, and refineries have to have special kit that's added to the cokers and hydrocrackers, because these are heavier, more complex hydrocarbon molecules, and they take more energy to break down. That's why they sell at a lower price. So we've got a 10.5 million barrel a day market. And that figure, by the way, comes from S&P Global energy economist Kevin Byrne, who's been working in this field I've been interviewing for a decade. So I think these numbers are fairly solid. That means that if Smith achieves her goal, Alberta will produce 75% of all of the global heavies that by 2035. Who are some of the competitors? Well, let's have a look. And these are all around 1 million barrels a day. Mexico, with its Maya grade, Venezuela, Iraq, with its Basra heavy, Saudi Arabia, Iran. Right there, you've got maybe 6 or 7 million barrels a day. And then there's a long list of countries like Brazil and Ecuador and Colombia that produce 100,000 barrels a day, 200,000 barrels a day. And it all adds up to a supply of about, 10.5 million barrels. And there are a couple of wrinkles in here because Saudi Arabia, some of the production that it cut back over the last few years is heavy. And so when they're now that it's bringing that production back on stream, putting it into the market, then the question will be how much of it will be heavy. And the figures that I've seen in terms of its potential is about flat out, if it was running flat out, would be about 3 million barrels a day. So three times what it's currently producing. This is the competition. And frankly, Alberta doesn't have, Alberta is very competitive within North America, which accounts for about half of all global refining capacity. Okay. This is really important. And probably about three-quarters of those refineries were built specifically for Alberta heavy crude. That's one of the reasons why, when Donald Trump threatens tariffs or, the refineries can't just switch to light sweet crude from the Permian. It doesn't work that way. Well, once your refineries configured for heavy, you're stuck with heavy. It costs a lot of money to reconfigure. So essentially, Alberta already holds about 65%, say two-thirds, of the North American market. And the American market. And here's the really important thing. It's the most competitive barrel on cost and quality. Okay. So if they were going to increase production, that extra 2 million barrels a day, 2 million barrels a day of market share that Alberta doesn't have, maybe they could push out other grades, maybe Brazil and Mexico, push them out of Mexico and Venezuela. Venezuela's in and out because of Trump putting sanctions on and lifting them and then putting them back on again. But presumably, it'll probably come back in the market at some point. So all of this is kind of in flux, but maybe it can compete and take the rest of the United States market. Maybe it can't. What about in China? Well, Saudi Arabia and Iraq they're right there, and it costs $2 on one of those big oil tankers to get it from the field over to China. Costs Canada about $18 because it's got to go on the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which costs $11, and it's got another buck of insurance and dockage, and then it goes on a ship, and by the time it gets to China, it's $17, $18, somewhere in that range. So it's a sometimes competitive, maybe a marginal barrel in China's market, but it's not a competitive barrel. It's not going to push out the Saudis or the Iraqis who are well established in that market, both in the refineries and in the petrochemical complexes. And that market tends to rely a lot on long-term contracts. So how in the world is the Alberta government going to increase the production of ultra-heavy sour crude from the oil sands from 3.5 million barrels a day to 7.5 million barrels a day in the midst of a very competitive market? And we haven't even talked about peak oil demand. Because, of course, the International Energy Agency and a whole slew of other forecasting agencies and companies agree more or less with the IEA. Peak demand in 2030, decline begins early 2030s. For some of them, it's 2035. Some of them, it's late 2030s. But everybody agrees pretty much that there's going to be a peak at the end of the year. How do you plan to double your oil production at a time when the market is saying, no, we're electrifying, or transportation is being electrified, and as a consequence, there's less demand for our product. Okay, that's the first problem. Then here's the next part of the mandate letter. Secure agreement and approval from the federal government for the construction of a new bitumen pipeline to the northwest coast of British Columbia and work to advance other pipeline projects and corridors to the United States, Ontario, Hudson Bay, and the Arctic. Goodness gracious. So now I count five pipelines that are going to be that she wants built. And of course, if you're going to double oil production, you've got to get it to market somehow. And pipeline is really the only it's the least cost and safest way, according to the industry, to move the oil. So now you're going to have another 4 million barrels of capacity in all of those pipelines. Those are big. Those are big pipelines, you know. But here's the kicker: bitumen is so thick that it needs 20 to 30, and usually around 30% of a lighter oil mixed it in to get it to flow in the pipeline. Usually it's like peanut butter. So if you want peanut butter to flow, you've got to dilute it, right? So if you take the 4 million barrels a day of extra production and you add another 30%, you need like 1.2 million barrels a day of shipping capacity, pipeline capacity. Now we're up to 5.2 million. That would be 5 million barrel a day pipelines that would have to be built to all of those points that I just mentioned. That's a mind-boggling amount. And the country has had hard enough time doing two projects, which was the Line 3 expansion in Ontario, and then the Trans Mountain expansion out to the West Coast, which just came into operation last year. Who's going to build 5 pipelines? We're having enough. The logistics around this, the politics around this, the capital requirements are just mind-boggling. Okay, so we have lots of problems with that. Now let's talk about the regulatory changes that have to be put into place. The first one is the mature asset strategy. Now, this is, remember R-Star back when, prior to becoming Premier, Danielle Smith was an registered oil and gas lobbyist from 2019 to 2022 when she became Premier. And one of her favorite program, the thing that she lobbied for, was R-Star. And basically, it was a $20 billion program. It provided credits for drilling. It was complex. It's not going to be put into effect. And Professor Andrew Leach at the University of Alberta estimated that it would actually cost the taxpayers about $6 billion, but maybe more than that, depending on how it was implemented. So taxpayers were being asked to pay for the industry's orphan wells, its inactive wells, its wells that hadn't been decommissioned. There's a principle called polluter pay, where if it's your mess, you clean it up. The public should never, ever have to clean up industry's mess. But that's exactly what Smith is asking them to do with this mature asset strategy. If you want to know some of the details, I did an interview with Mark Dorn, who's an oil and gas administrative law consultant and has kind of been part of the group that's been opposing this. They've gone out and done public meetings in rural Alberta, and landowners are livid. There's a lot of opposition to this. And in fact, Mark was shocked when he read this mandate letter because the mature asset strategy is still under consultation. So how do you direct your Minister of Energy to go implement it when it hasn't even been decided what it's going to be, or if there's going to be one? So it looks like, the public consultations with rural landowners is basically just a fig leaf. It's just pro forma, check a box, and then it's going to be done anyway. Okay, that's number one. The second thing is the Alberta Energy Regulators Work Plan. Now, as I detailed in Unethical Oil Part 2, you can find it on the website from 2023. The Alberta Energy Regulator is captured by the oil and gas industry. It is ineffectual. There are many, 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 many problems with the regulator that would have to be addressed, that should be addressed now, that aren't being addressed. And if you imagine if the oil production in the province doubled, what would you have to do to the regulator to do all of the approve applications and reclamation and all of the infrastructure to support all of that? I mean, again, the mind boggles, because they can't even get it right with what they have now, and they want to double the industry. And of course, what Smith says, as the industry says, and the Premier says, and King says all the time that that Alberta has a world class, in fact, the best regulatory system in the world. You know where that came from? In 2013, CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, commissioned Meg Worley, who's big engineering company, to do a study of comparable regulatory regimes around the world, and UK and Norway and the US and so on. And it came back and it said, "Oh, Alberta's got the best by far." But you know what they did? Is they said they restricted the terms of reference, and they said you can only assess the design of the regulation of the regulatory regime, not its performance. And I've interviewed Professor Martin Olashinsky from the University of Calgary Law Department, and he points out that the Alberta legislation and regulations are peppered, littered, shot through with the word discretion. And that's the biggest problem here. So you can design a regulatory regime to do X, but if you are allowing the minister, if you're allowing the regulator management, if you're allowing the inspectors on the ground to always exercise discretion, then you're going to get Y. And that's the thing that was never. So it's a little bit of, they're pulling the wool over our eyes. And this talking point gets repeated over and over again. So that's another huge issue. They can't regulate properly now. How are they going to double production and improve regulation at the same time, or enforcement of regulation at the same time? Number 3, the new liability management framework. Now, what this means is the unfunded environmental liabilities. So we're talking orphan wells, we're talking tailings ponds, we're talking old pipelines, gas. It's unfunded is approximately $260 billion. And that came to light in 2018. There was a 2018 PowerPoint presentation given by the fellow who was heading up the AER's liability management team. And he gave a PowerPoint that then got leaked to the National Observer. And I've got a copy of it. And that was his estimate, $260 billion. So whether it's more, whether it's less, is such a big number that we can't wrap our head around it. And the important thing here is, way back in 1938, when they brought in the first regulator, the question was addressed, and when do you take security to ensure that a well or any kind of an oil and gas asset gets reclaimed? Do you take it at the beginning of the asset's life, or do you take it at some other point in its life, maybe at the end? And a deliberate decision was made, as it was made all over North America, by the way, to collect it at the end, not at the beginning. And the problem with that is that the companies don't want to pay. And so what they do, not everyone, but a lot of them, what they do is a couple of things. Bundle up all of their depleted assets and sell them to some little company that sells them to another littler company, and then they go bankrupt, right? Or they put them in the inactive list, and there's some work that has to be done first before they can do that. And they sit there, and there's 80,000 wells in the inactive list right now. That's up from like 25,000 in the year 2000. And it's crazy. And the reason for that is that there is no timeline in the regulation requiring the operator to reclaim it. Like you would think that, okay, it's in the inactive list. Now you have 10 years and you have to reclaim it. No, it can literally sit there for decades, as long as the company doesn't go bankrupt. And so I am told there are hundreds of companies that are still registered. Every year there's a law firm somewhere that goes and pays their registration fee. So it's the companies on the books. They are the licensee of those wells, but they're not operating companies. They're just kept alive so that they don't turn out to be a liability and become an orphan well, and the government or the regulator might come back after the former operator. I mean, it's all kinds of things like this. So the new liability management, and let's give Smith some credit. I will say she had the backbone to enforce a mandatory spend on reclamation. She did that. And it was started out, it was supposed to, I think it was last year, it was supposed to be 700 million. And they were supposed to escalate over time. But now, very quietly, it appears that they've settled on 700 million and they're going to stick with that. And then there's $135 million that the Orphan Well Association puts into reclaiming their inventory. That basically all that does is tread water. Doesn't make any dent in the old inventory or the newer inventory. That's why they're bringing in the mature asset strategy to get the public to pay for the old stuff. So to sum up, Danielle Smith has given direction to Energy Minister Brian Jean to double the oil production from 4 million barrels a day to 8 million barrels a day by 2035, to try to get 5 pipelines, and that's just 5 locations. I mean, there could be multiple pipelines to the various locations, but 5 pipelines at a minimum to all these various spots. And of course, the big controversial one right now is to Prince Rupert or Kitimat on the British Columbia coast. And then he has to oversee the implementation or the improvement of all of these huge regulatory problems that the governments for decades have been grappling with and have only made it worse. This is the irony. I did an interview, many interviews with Drew Uchuk, who's a public interest lawyer that tracks this stuff and publishes about it. And he talks about how every iteration of the regulations gets worse. The problem never gets solved. And every scheme that they bring in fails. So you've got ambitions to increase the oil production. You've got a huge number of pipelines you have to build, and all of this at just years before we will likely hit peak oil demand. And you've got a regulatory regime that's just in tatters, and you've got a huge problem with environmental liabilities. How does this make it easy? This is insane. This is literally not a rational approach to Alberta's biggest industry. And frankly, Canada's biggest exporter at about $170 billion, which is, like 2.5 times, almost 3 times the value of automobiles, which is number 2. So this is a huge issue. When you see Smith in public arguing, fighting, Ottawa is impeding us. Oh, final question, issue I want to raise. Is the oil and gas industry on board with her? Because this is a big issue, because at the end of the day, Danielle Smith doesn't go and invest her money or the public money into these industry. The companies have to do that. And so ever since March, the industry CEOs have sent 3 letters to Prime Minister Mark Carney demanding change, and the things that they want 9 horrible regulations that they don't like. They want them struck down, like the Bill C-48 and Bill C-69 and so on. And they want basically what they've said is there's a generational opportunity, and they demand that Ottawa let the industry achieve its full potential. Now, they never say 8 million barrels a day, but given the tenor of the comments they're making, they're essentially, in my opinion, endorsing Smith's view of the future. That's what they want. They want to double. Why would they want to do that? Well, because then that makes Canada pretty much equal to Russia and Saudi Arabia when it comes to oil production. The U.S. is number 1, though the other 2 are 2 and 3, and Canada is number 4. Lots more money, lots more clout in markets and political clout for Alberta. It's not hard to see the attraction of this vision, but implementing it, in particular, given the context of today, is absolutely insane.